Hi, I'm Sly Grandpa. Let's start our story. I never thought I'd end up writing something like this, but after everything that's happened, maybe getting it all out will finally give me peace. I'm 78 years old, widowed for nearly a decade, and I've lived in the same old farmhouse since I was a boy. It's not much to look at anymore, the paint's peeling, the roof creaks when it rains, and the barn hasn't seen a cow in 30 years, but it's mine. Every board, every nail, every tree in the yard has a story tied to my life. My late wife, Margaret, used to say that the land itself carried our laughter. We raised our children here, watched seasons change together, and even after her passing, this place has been the only constant that makes me feel close to her. I've always believed that I'd die here, quietly, with my boots by the door and her photo by my bed. But a few months ago, my family, my own flesh and blood, started whispering about plans for the future. At first, it was small comments at Sunday dinners. My daughter-in-law saying, "It's not safe for Dad to be alone out here," or my eldest son pointing out that I'd be better off somewhere with medical staff. I brushed it off. I'm old, yes, but I'm not helpless. I still chop wood, drive my old Chevy into town, and keep up the garden. Sure, I move slower than I used to, but I've earned every ache in these bones. Then one evening, they staged what I can only call an intervention. My sons, my daughter, even two of the grandkids, they sat me down in my own living room and told me they'd found a wonderful nursing facility about an hour away. They spoke like it was already decided, as if I didn't have a voice in the matter. My daughter said, "Dad, you can't keep living like this. You'll fall or hurt yourself. This place is too much for you." I felt my face burning. I asked them point blank if this was really about my safety, or about what comes after. You see, my land, old as it is, sits on valuable ground. Developers have been sniffing around for years, offering obscene amounts of money for it. I always turn them down because this place is my home, not just dirt and timber. But as I looked around that circle of familiar faces, I saw something that broke me, dollar signs in their eyes. They didn't answer me directly, just kept talking about my well-being and how lonely I must be. I told them I wasn't moving. That was final. But the way they glanced at each other, the quiet smirks, the exchange of looks, I knew I was no longer seen as their father or grandfather. I was an obstacle. That night, I sat by the fireplace staring at Margaret's picture, my fists trembling. They wanted me gone. They wanted this land. And they thought age made me blind, weak, and easy to shove aside. They had no idea who they were dealing with. A week after that so-called intervention, things started happening around the house that I couldn't ignore. At first, it was subtle. My mailbox mysteriously got knocked down one night. Then the electricity flickered out even though the rest of the road had power. My son came by the next morning and said, "See, Dad? Stuff like this proves you can't keep up anymore. Better to move before something serious happens." I wanted to believe it was coincidence, but my gut told me otherwise. I've been around long enough to know when something stinks. My family wasn't waiting for me to make the choice, they were trying to push me into it. One evening, I caught my daughter-in-law snooping around the barn. When I asked her what she was doing, she gave me some nonsense about looking for an old rocking chair she thought I'd stored there. Funny thing is, she's never cared a lick about antiques before. My suspicion grew. Then came the paperwork. My middle son, Mark, dropped off a stack of insurance forms he said I needed to sign in case I moved into the home. I pretended to squint at the small print, playing the doddering old man they thought I was. But my mind was sharp, and my reading glasses were in my pocket. I waited until he left, then sat down under the lamp and looked carefully. They weren't insurance forms. They were transfer agreements, documents that would grant my children power of attorney over my estate if I became incapacitated. If I had signed, they'd control the land, the house, everything. I felt my stomach drop, then tighten into something I hadn't felt in years, cold, simmering anger. My own children were plotting to strip me of everything Margaret and I had built, everything I'd worked my hands raw for. That night I couldn't sleep. I walked the house, every room echoing with memories, my late wife's voice in my head. "Don't let them take what's ours, Henry." And I knew she was right. I realized then that they didn't see me as family anymore. To them, I was just a stubborn old man standing in the way of a payday. They thought age made me powerless. What they didn't know was that I'd been planning for years. You see, when developers first started circling the land, I spoke to a lawyer friend of mine from town. We drafted some papers, tucked away safely, that no one else knew about. I never thought I'd need them against my own blood, but life's funny that way. When Mark came back 2 days later, smiling like a fox with those papers in hand, I told him I needed time to think it over. I played the role of the confused, weary father, nodding and thanking him for caring. But inside, the gears were already turning. If they wanted a war for this land, then by God, I'd give them one. And I'd make sure they never saw it coming. The next phase of their little scheme came faster than I expected. My daughter, Claire, started dropping by unannounced, armed with groceries I hadn't asked for and a syrupy smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She'd fuss around the kitchen, sigh dramatically at the dust on the shelves, then say things like, "Dad, this place is really falling apart. Don't you want somewhere nicer?" I could see the rehearsed pity in her face. She thought she was softening me up, making me doubt myself. But all it did was confirm what I already knew: they were circling like vultures. Then came the accident. My front steps, sturdy oak planks I'd repaired myself last spring, suddenly gave way beneath me. I only fell halfway before catching myself on the railing, but my shin was bruised black and blue. When my sons heard, they pounced on it like wolves. "See, Dad? This is exactly what we were talking about. What if you'd broken your hip?" That night, as I iced my leg, I sat in my recliner and thought about how deliberate it felt. The screws had been loosened. I know because I checked. They wanted me to hurt myself, to scare me into compliance. That was the breaking point. I stopped pretending to be caught off guard and started watching them the way they were watching me. Every word, every action, every slip of the tongue. And I started putting my plan in motion. First, I paid a quiet visit to my lawyer friend, Tom. He's an old hunting buddy, and he's seen me through more storms than I can count. I told him everything, about the fake paperwork, the pressure, the accidents. He didn't even blink before pulling out the file we'd prepared years ago. My land had already been transferred into a trust, irrevocable, airtight, with me as the lifetime tenant. That meant nobody could touch it, not without my consent. But here's the best part: when Margaret passed, I'd added a stipulation. Upon my death, the land wouldn't go to my children, it would go to a charity we both supported. They had no idea. Tom and I decided not to reveal the cards just yet. Let them think they're winning. Let them believe I'm frail, confused, and easy to manipulate. The sweeter the victory when the truth comes out. I returned home and let them keep playing their game. When Claire came by with her fake concern, I nodded along. When Mark asked if I'd signed the papers, I said I'd misplaced them. When my eldest, John, suggested visiting the nursing home, just to look, I agreed to think about it. Meanwhile, I started documenting everything. Photos of the loosened screws on the steps. Copies of the false documents. Even a little recorder I kept in my shirt pocket during our family talks. Because if they wanted a battle, I wasn't just going to defend myself. I was going to bury them with their own greed. And they had no idea that their old man still had plenty of fight left in him. It didn't take long for them to crank up the pressure. Once they realized I wasn't budging, the tone of their visits changed. The fake sweetness faded, and what came out instead was frustration, thinly veiled threats dressed up as concern. One night, John, my eldest, came over after dark. He didn't even knock, just walked right in like he owned the place. He stood in the living room with his arms crossed, staring at me like I was a stubborn child instead of the man who raised him. "Dad, this is getting ridiculous," he said. "You're putting yourself in danger, and frankly, you're putting us in a tough spot too. If something happens to you out here, we're the ones who'll have to clean up the mess." That word, mess, hit me like a slap. That's all I was to him now. Not a father. Not a man who worked his fingers to the bone so he could have a comfortable life. Just a burden. I didn't argue. I let him talk, let him rant about how I needed to be realistic. All the while, my recorder was tucked neatly in my pocket, capturing every word. The next day, Claire showed up again, this time with pamphlets from 3 different nursing homes. She spread them out on a table like vacation brochures, her voice dripping with false cheer. "Look, Dad, this one has a garden. You'd love that, wouldn't you?" I played my part, leaning in close, pretending to squint at the pictures. "Oh yes, very nice," I muttered. She looked so pleased with herself, like she thought she was finally breaking me down. What she didn't notice was that I was sliding one of those pamphlets into my drawer, right next to the copies of their forged paperwork. Evidence. But the real kicker came 2 nights later. I woke up at 3 in the morning to the smell of smoke. My heart nearly stopped. I rushed through the house, and sure enough, someone had tossed a smoldering rag through the barn window. By the time I doused it with the old fire extinguisher, the rag was nothing but ash. That was no accident. That was a warning. The next morning, I called Tom. He told me something I'd already been thinking: let them keep pushing, Henry. Every step they take digs their hole deeper. We'll make sure they fall right in. So that's exactly what I did. I set up cameras around the property, small, discreet, and motion-triggered. I kept my recorder close. And I played dumb, letting them believe I was worn down and on the verge of giving in. Because if they were willing to go as far as fire to scare me off, then they were desperate. And desperation makes people sloppy. And when they finally slipped, I'd be ready. A few days after the fire scare, the bold move finally came. It was a Saturday afternoon when Mark and Claire showed up together, both of them dressed a little too nicely for a casual visit. They had smiles plastered on their faces, but their eyes told a different story: cold, calculating, impatient. They sat me down at the kitchen table like I was some senile old man who needed guidance. Mark slid another stack of papers across the table. This time, he didn't even bother calling them insurance forms. "Dad, these are just to help us manage things for you. Nothing changes for now, it just gives us the ability to step in if something happens." I tilted my head like I didn't understand, picked up the pen, and twirled it in my fingers. "So this would make life easier for all of you?" I asked. Claire leaned forward eagerly. "Exactly. It's just practical. Think of it as peace of mind." I let the silence hang, then gave a tired smile. "Well, if it's just practical." I uncapped the pen and slowly dragged it toward the paper. Their faces lit up, greedy, triumphant, like vultures who'd finally spotted fresh meat. And then, right before the tip touched the page, I accidentally knocked my coffee cup over the stack. Papers ruined. Ink smeared. "Oh dear, these old hands," I muttered. "Clumsy me. I'll have to look them over again once you bring me a fresh copy." The look on their faces was priceless, pure rage bubbling beneath the surface, barely masked with fake reassurances. They left soon after, muttering about wasting time. What they didn't know was that the whole scene was caught crystal clear on one of the tiny cameras I'd hidden in the kitchen clock. Their words, their eagerness, their scheme, it was all recorded. That night, I sat in my chair listening to the playback, the corner of my mouth curling into a grin. Every move they made to pressure me was ammunition I could use later. And they were giving me plenty. But I didn't want just to expose them. No, that would be too easy. They needed to feel it, really feel it, the same way they made me feel small, helpless, disposable. So I began planning something bigger. Something that would not only strip them of their victory but leave them choking on the bitterness of their own greed. I wasn't just going to stop them. I was going to turn their little game inside out. And the first step was to let them believe, absolutely believe, that they were winning. The act of giving in began the very next week. I decided if they wanted to see me weak, I'd give them the performance of a lifetime. When John stopped by to check on me, I shuffled to the door with exaggerated slowness, leaning heavier on my cane than usual. I let my voice crack when I spoke, and even forgot where I'd put my glasses while they were hanging right on my shirt. I could see his eyes light up as he drank it in. To him, it wasn't an act, it was proof that his old man was finally slipping. That evening at dinner, I delivered the line I knew they were all waiting for. I pushed my fork around the plate, sighed deeply, and said, "Maybe you kids are right. Maybe I can't handle the house anymore." The silence that followed was thick. Then Claire clapped her hands together like she'd just won the lottery. "Dad, this is the best decision you've ever made. You'll be so comfortable, and we'll handle everything for you." I even let a tear slip down my cheek. Not from sadness. Oh no. From laughter I was holding in. Because while they were busy toasting themselves with wine and smiles, I was already a step ahead. The trust Tom and I set up years ago meant the house and land weren't even mine to hand over. And every bit of pressure, every smirk, every self-congratulatory toast was being documented. But I wanted to push it further. I wanted them not just exposed, but humiliated. So I told them I'd agree to tour the nursing home they'd been shoving down my throat. Claire nearly fell out of her chair with excitement. "That's wonderful, Dad. We'll set it up this week." As they buzzed around planning, I quietly slipped into my study later that night and called Tom again. We discussed timing, how to align everything perfectly. He laughed when I told him how well they'd swallowed the bait. "Henry, you've always been a hell of a poker player," he said. "I wasn't just playing cards this time. I was playing with their futures." The trick was patience. Let them think the finish line was in sight. Let them start celebrating. Because when people think they've won, that's when they're the most careless. And that's when you strike. The nursing home tour was scheduled for a Thursday morning. Claire insisted on driving me herself, saying it would be special bonding time. I nodded, smiled weakly, and let her believe she was the doting daughter rescuing her poor, frail father. Inside, though, I was savoring every second, because I already knew how this little trip would play out. When we arrived, the place was exactly what I expected: sterile hallways, smiling staff with dead eyes, the faint smell of bleach and overcooked vegetables. Claire walked me through like it was a luxury resort, pointing out the activity room and therapy pool. I shuffled along slowly, nodding, pretending to be impressed. Then came the kicker: the administrator pulled out a thick folder of forms. Claire's eyes gleamed as she leaned over me. "Dad, this is just preliminary paperwork. Nothing binding. Just to get you in the system." Of course, I recognized the trick. Those preliminary forms included consent for transfer of finances, billing authority, even permission to sell personal assets to cover costs. I knew because I'd already asked Tom to get me a copy of the exact documents this chain used. So, I played my part. I picked up the pen, let my hand shake, and scribbled a signature that looked almost, but not quite, like my own. Sloppy, wobbly, nothing that would ever hold up under scrutiny. Claire beamed like she'd just struck gold. On the way home, she couldn't hide her excitement. "This is the right choice, Dad. You'll be so much happier, and we'll take care of everything. Don't you worry about a thing." I mumbled something about being relieved. She never noticed the tiny camera button on my shirt recording her gloating the entire drive. That night, I sat in my study with Tom, who had stopped by with a bottle of bourbon. We watched the footage together, Claire's smug grin, her coaxing words, her delight at my signature. Tom shook his head. "They're hanging themselves, Henry. All you'll need to do is tug the rope." And that's when I told him the second phase of my plan, not just to block them, not just to expose them, but to turn the tables in a way they'd never recover from. See, I had something my children didn't know about, a card I'd kept hidden for decades. It wasn't just about the trust or the recordings. It was something far more explosive. And when the time was right, I'd use it to make sure they never saw a dime, never touched a scrap of this land, and never forgot the day they tried to bury me. The nursing home tour wasn't the end of their scheme. It was the beginning of their downfall. That hidden card I mentioned. It had been sitting quietly in a safe deposit box at the bank for years, gathering dust while I lived my life. Back when developers first came sniffing around, offering money that could make a man dizzy, I decided to do a little digging of my own. I learned that my land wasn't just valuable for its location, it sat on top of a stretch of mineral-rich soil. Limestone, shale, even traces of natural gas. I never told my children. Why would I? Margaret and I agreed it was better left untouched. We didn't need the money, we had enough, and we valued peace more than wealth. But I kept the documentation, surveys, offers, even a letter of intent from a company that would have paid more money than my kids could imagine. All locked away, forgotten, until now. If my children thought they were fighting over a nice chunk of farmland, they had no clue they were actually clawing for a gold mine. And they certainly didn't realize they'd already lost it decades ago when I put the land in trust. I sat at the kitchen table that night, the documents spread out before me like cards in a winning hand. My fingers traced Margaret's neat handwriting in the margins of one of the survey reports. "Don't tell the kids. This will only divide them," she'd written. God, she knew them better than I did. The next day, I invited them all over under the guise of discussing the move. I played it perfectly, voice weak, movement slow, eyes watery. They gathered around, whispering like they were about to inherit the world. Mark asked the question outright. "So, Dad, have you made a decision about the house?" I looked at them for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Yes. I think it's time." The room practically vibrated with excitement. Claire squeezed my hand, her nails digging into my skin as if she could physically hold on to her victory. John poured himself a drink, grinning from ear to ear. But what they didn't notice was the little envelope sitting in my desk drawer, ready to be revealed at the perfect moment. Inside was every piece of proof, about the trust, about the mineral rights, about their failed power grabs. I wasn't ready to show my hand yet. No, not while they still thought they were on the brink of winning. I wanted them to lean in closer, to believe the prize was within reach. Because the harder they leaned, the harder they'd fall when I yanked it away. That night, as they left the house buzzing with plans, I stood on the porch and watched them go. The cool night air filled my lungs, and for the first time in weeks, I felt calm. They thought they had me cornered. They thought my story was nearly over. But I was just getting started. Once they thought I'd agreed to the nursing home, the real circus began. My kids stopped pretending to care about my well-being and started circling the property like sharks that smelled blood in the water. John brought a man in a suit by one afternoon, introducing him as just a friend from the city who's interested in farmland. I watched from the porch as they strolled around, the stranger pointing at the barn, the creek, the wide open fields. They spoke in hushed tones, but I didn't need to hear the words, I knew exactly what was happening. They were already shopping me out. 2 days later, Claire showed up with a tape measure and started walking through the house like she was staging it for a sale. She barely even said hello, just started muttering things like, "We'll have to redo the kitchen, maybe knock out this wall," as if I wasn't sitting right there in the living room. Mark, meanwhile, kept pushing paperwork under my nose. This time he tried a new angle. "Dad, we'll need access to your bank account to cover the nursing home deposit." Just sign here and it'll all be simpler. I coughed, wheezed, fumbled with the papers, then tucked them aside. I promised him I'd look them over, when I felt clearer. Of course, I never did. But my little kitchen clock camera captured every second of his pitch. They were so sure victory was close, they couldn't even hide their greed anymore. And that's exactly what I wanted. Meanwhile, I quietly made my own preparations. Tom helped me arrange for certified copies of the trust documents, along with a statement from the bank confirming the mineral rights information I'd locked away years ago. Everything was neat, legal, and impossible to dispute. But here's where it gets good, I also started leaking little hints. I accidentally left an old survey map out on the kitchen counter when Claire dropped by. Her eyes flicked to the highlighted areas marked limestone and natural gas, and though she tried to play it cool, I saw the spark ignite in her. By the next week, they weren't just preparing to sell the land, they were fighting over who'd get the bigger slice. The whispers got sharper, the smiles tighter. I caught John snapping at Claire in the driveway, hissing something about splitting it fair this time. They thought I was fading, slipping out of the picture while they scrambled to grab the spoils. What they didn't realize was that I was the one writing the ending. And soon, very soon, I was going to show them just how badly they'd underestimated the old man in the rocking chair. I knew the perfect opportunity would come at the next family meeting. They wanted one to discuss the sale, so I let them have it. I even suggested we meet at the house. It was their idea that it should be formal, with contracts and plans spread out on the dining table. I agreed, pretending to be frail and compliant. The day arrived, and they came armed with paperwork, laptops, and overly confident smiles. Claire had a legal pad in hand, John had a stack of contracts, and Mark had spreadsheets. They practically radiated greed. I welcomed them with a weak smile, shook their hands like I was the old man they thought I'd become. I sat back and let them take the floor. Claire started, "Dad, we've done the math. If we sell the property, split it fairly, and cover your expenses, you'll be comfortable for life in the nursing home." She paused, eyes scanning my face for a sign of agreement. I nodded slowly. "I see, very practical." Then came John, with the man from the city. He laid out an offer letter, one of those serious inquiries from developers letters. My kids didn't notice my hands gripping the arms of my chair, quiet satisfaction building. And then, the moment I'd been waiting for. I leaned forward, cleared my throat, and said, "Before we go any further, I think you all need to see something." I opened the drawer, pulled out the envelope with the trust papers and the mineral rights documentation, and placed them on the table. The sound of them hitting the wood was like a hammer. I watched their faces change in real time, first confusion, then disbelief, then panic. Claire gasped. Mark's jaw dropped. John turned pale, staring at the documents as if they had just turned to fire in his hands. What is this?" Claire stammered. I smiled, slow and deliberate. "This, my dears, is why all your little schemes have been useless. The land isn't yours to sell. It hasn't been for decades. And as for the mineral rights..." I let my eyes linger on each of them, watching the realization settle in, those belong to me. And when I'm gone, they won't go to any of you. The room was dead silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator. I could see the rage in their eyes, the sheer disbelief, and yet they couldn't touch it. Every attempt to control me, every forged paper, every push to get me out, they had all failed. And that was just the beginning. The panic was immediate. Claire dropped her legal pad like it was burning her hand. Mark scrambled to pick up the developer's offer letter, waving it in front of me like a shield, but I just shook my head slowly. John's face went from pale to red in the span of seconds, his fists clenching at his sides. "This can't be real," Claire hissed. "There's no way you did this without telling us." I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands, and let them stew in the tension. "Oh, I could have told you," I said softly. But where would be the fun in that? Mark tried to argue next. Dad, listen. We were just trying to help. We didn't mean any harm. Surely we can negotiate. I held up a hand. Negotiate? You mean sell what isn't yours? You've spent months undermining me, lying to me, even trying to scare me into signing things that weren't real. And now you expect me to cooperate? They froze. I could see the truth settling in. Every whisper, every veiled threat, every staged accident. They had created their own trap. And now they were caught in it. Then came the final blow. I pulled out my phone and played the recordings from the kitchen and living room, the countless conversations where they'd schemed, pushed, begged, and threatened me. Their own voices, words of greed and manipulation, filled the room. Claire's lips parted in shock, Mark tried to snatch the phone from me, and John simply sank into his chair, dumbstruck. All of this, I said, gesturing to the documents and the recordings, was captured for a reason. You've been plotting against me for months. And yet, here you are, thinking you still hold the cards. I could see it in their eyes, the realization that everything they'd done to push me out, to take my home, to cash in on my life, had failed spectacularly. And there was nothing they could do about it. For the first time in decades, I felt completely, utterly in control. And yet, I knew they weren't going to take this lying down. They were desperate, dangerous, and humiliated. I had to be careful. The final act was still coming, and I wanted it to sting. After the recordings and documents had done their initial work, my kids slunk into stunned silence, trying to process the reality of what had just been laid before them. They were fumbling, whispering to one another, their carefully constructed plans collapsing piece by piece. But I knew that wasn't enough. Humiliation alone wouldn't teach them the full lesson. That's when I introduced the final phase of my plan, leverage. A few months ago, I had quietly contacted the local newspaper under a pseudonym, hinting at the story of a family trying to manipulate an elderly father out of his rightful property. I didn't give names, just enough to pique interest. The editor, naturally, smelled drama and wanted details. I promised them an interview, from the perspective of the older generation, and it was scheduled to run soon. I leaned back in my chair and watched as Claire, Mark, and John squirmed. I let them stew for a few days, feeding just enough information to keep their paranoia alive. Claire began calling lawyers frantically, Mark started scribbling frantic notes about mineral rights, and John, well, John didn't say much. He just stared at the walls, pale and sweaty, realizing he'd underestimated his old man completely. Then came the moment I had been waiting for. I invited the whole family over one evening under the guise of a casual dinner, just us, talking things over. They arrived eager, cautious, convinced they were about to smooth things out and convince me to settle. I served a modest meal, talked about old memories, laughed softly at stories from my youth. And then, just as dessert arrived, I leaned forward and said softly, by the way, the story will be in the paper tomorrow. Every detail of your attempts to manipulate me will be public. Names, faces, actions, everything. Claire's fork clattered to her plate. Mark swallowed hard, his face draining of color. John's hands trembled on the table. I let them sit in that silence, tasting the bitterness of their own choices. And as I sipped my tea, I couldn't help but smile. For years, they had underestimated me, thinking age meant weakness, that my memories and wisdom didn't count for anything. But now, I had every card, every advantage. And the final checkmate was coming. The next morning, the tension in the house was unbearable. They hadn't slept much. Claire kept checking her phone, Mark kept pacing, and John, well, John didn't even move from the armchair. They were trapped in their own panic, waiting for the newspaper, waiting for the hammer to fall. I decided it was time to accelerate the finale. I called them into the living room one by one under the pretense of explaining the next steps of my supposed move to the nursing home. Their faces were masks of desperation and false bravado. I started with the trust. I spread the papers on the coffee table, letting them absorb the sheer weight of legalese they couldn't begin to contest. Everything in this house, every acre of land, every tree, every scrap of wood, I said slowly, pointing to the documents, is legally protected. Not one of you has any claim, no matter what you thought. They tried to interrupt, but I raised a hand. Wait, there's more. I pulled out the mineral rights documents, carefully laminated and organized. Their eyes widened when they realized what they were looking at. This land isn't just a farm, I said. It's a gold mine. Literally. Limestone, shale, natural gas. If it were sold or leased, it would make millions. And yet, I let my voice trail, watching their expressions twist, you will see none of it. All of it stays here, managed exactly as Margaret and I intended. Claire tried to argue, stammering about, but the developers, and we just thought, but I cut her off. You thought you could push me out, cheat me, scare me. And yet, here you are, powerless, exposed, and humiliated. Every threat, every scheme, every forged document you produced is now evidence of your greed and malice. And it's all going to be public. Mark looked like he might pass out. John buried his face in his hands. Claire's lips trembled. The shock was absolute. I leaned back, letting it all sink in. This house, this land, the legacy Margaret and I built, untouched. And when the time comes, it will go exactly where we intended. You've proven yourselves unworthy. They sat in silence, staring at me as if I had just become a stranger. The realization had hit them hard, they had gambled on the weakness of an old man and lost spectacularly. And I smiled. Because victory had never tasted this sweet. The newspaper hit the stands the next morning, and the reaction was instantaneous. I stayed home, sipping my coffee on the porch, listening to the chaos unfold. Within an hour, my phone was buzzing non-stop with calls from neighbors, old friends, and even distant relatives. Everyone was talking about the story. Did you see what the kids tried to do to old Mr. Henry? Meanwhile, I could hear the flurry of activity inside. Claire was yelling at Mark over the phone, both of them trying to spin their side of the story. John paced back and forth, muttering under his breath, a mix of fear and shame. Their carefully crafted reputations, the ones they had worked so hard to maintain in town, were crumbling before their eyes. I watched the front yard, seeing neighbors peek over the fence, curious and supportive. People I'd known for decades were calling, offering help, shaking their heads in disbelief. The family's secret attempts to manipulate me, their greedy schemes, and the audacity of their plan had been broadcast for the entire community to witness. Then came the moment I had been waiting for. They realized it wasn't just public humiliation, they were also legally blocked from touching a single thing. Every developer call, every potential offer, they all hit a brick wall. The trust and the mineral rights ensured that not a penny, not a square inch of land, could be moved or sold without my permission. Claire finally slumped in a chair, exhausted and defeated. Mark's shoulders sagged, and John didn't speak at all. I went inside, calmly poured myself a second cup of coffee, and walked past them, smiling as I heard Claire whisper, "I can't believe he outsmarted us completely." I leaned against the doorway, my eyes sweeping across the room. Believe it, dears. Never underestimate an old man who knows his home, his land, and his family better than they know themselves. And at that moment, I realized the sweetest revenge isn't about money or spite, it's about reclaiming control and making the manipulators stare, helpless, at the consequences of their own actions. But the final act, the one that would leave them truly broken, was yet to come. It was finally time for the curtain to fall. The family had been humiliated publicly, blocked legally, and left scrambling for any semblance of control, but I wanted them to feel the full weight of their own greed, the lesson engraved deep in their bones. I called them together one last time, under the guise of a final discussion about my move to the nursing home. They came in, wary, bruised by the newspaper coverage, but still clinging to the idea that maybe, just maybe, they could salvage something. I greeted them warmly, offered them tea, and let them settle in. And then, I smiled and said, "There's one more thing you need to know." I pulled out the last piece of the puzzle, a notarized statement from the developer who had once offered a fortune for the land. Not only had the offer been real, but the developer had been ready to pay double what anyone could imagine if the land had been under their control. And I had negotiated it decades ago, all while keeping my children completely in the dark. Their jaws dropped. Claire's hands flew to her mouth. Mark's face was pale, beads of sweat forming at his temples. John sank into his chair, utterly defeated. "You see," I said slowly, letting the words sink in, "every attempt you made, every push, every forged paper, every threat, was utterly useless. This land, these mineral rights, everything Margaret and I built, none of it is yours. And it never will be." They tried to speak, to argue, to bargain, but the words faltered on their lips. They had no legal ground, no leverage, no moral high ground. Nothing. I stood, feeling the years in my bones, but more alive than I had in decades. "You wanted to force me out, to take what isn't yours. You thought age made me weak. But I've lived long enough to know patience, to know strategy, and to know that the old man in the chair often sees what the young ones cannot." And then I said the words that finally ended it, "You've lost, every last one of you. And I forgive you, but you'll never forget this lesson. The house stays, the land stays, and I will remain here, exactly where I belong." Silence hung heavy, broken only by the ticking of the clock. They slumped, exhausted and humbled, forced to confront the reality of their own actions. I returned to my porch, watching the sun dip behind the trees. The air smelled of pine and earth, and for the first time in months, I felt a deep, unshakable peace. Margaret's picture smiled back at me from the mantel, and I whispered, "We did it, my love. I kept our home. I kept our life." The revenge had been complete. Not through violence, not through malice, but through patience, cunning, and the knowledge that time and wisdom favor those who wait. And for the first time in years, I could sit back, sip my coffee, and truly feel at home.